The moment I stepped through the grand double doors of the Whitfield house with my 7-year-old daughter Mia's hand in mine, I knew I had made a terrible mistake. The smell of mulled wine and fresh pine filled the air. Christmas carols played softly from hidden speakers, and the crackling fireplace cast warm shadows across the marble foyer where my family stood frozen, staring at us like we were ghosts who had no right to haunt their perfect holiday. My mother Margaret's eyes landed on Mia first, her face shifting from surprise to that cold, practiced disgust I remembered from the night I told her I was pregnant at 19. And behind her, my father Gerald clasped his hands and stared at the floor, while my brother Daniel forced a smile that never reached his eyes. My 16-year-old niece Zoe raised her phone immediately, already filming, her young face troubled as she watched the scene unfold in front of Christmas guests checking in at the front desk. My mother glided forward in her winter white suit, pearls gleaming at her throat, her silver blonde bob perfectly styled as always, and she stopped 3 feet away, close enough that everyone in the lobby could hear every word she was about to say. Her gaze flicked over Mia with such revulsion that I felt my daughter's hand tighten in mine, and when she spoke, her voice was low and sharp as a blade cutting through silk. "We discussed this, Lena," she said, her words deliberate and cruel. "You could come alone, but she could not. Only legitimate family belongs here at Christmas. So take your bastard child and leave." The word hung in the air like poison, and I watched Mia's small face crumple as tears pooled in her dark eyes that looked so much like mine. Around us, guests pretended to study their phones or the wreaths on the stone walls, but I could feel their shock radiating toward us in waves, their pity burning against my skin like acid. My father nodded slowly behind my mother, his silent agreement somehow worse than her spoken cruelty, and I felt something inside me crack that had been holding together for 14 years, that last fragile hope that maybe they had changed. I knelt down and pulled Mia close, whispering into her hair that everything would be okay, that Grandma was just confused, that we would leave soon and get hot chocolate somewhere warm and safe where people actually knew how to love. When I stood back up, I looked my mother straight in her cold blue eyes and said simply, "Understood," my voice calm and steady, so much calmer than the rage burning in my chest like white-hot coals. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and opened a text I had written 3 days ago, the one I hoped I would never need to send, the message to my attorney Priya Sethi that contained just 3 words: Clause 9, activate. I hit send and slipped my phone back into my pocket, feeling my heart pound against my ribs as 15 minutes crawled by in suffocating silence. The family returned to decorating the massive Christmas tree in the corner, my mother directing staff with imperious gestures, while my father poured himself another scotch with trembling hands that made the crystal clink against the bottle. Daniel hung ornaments with mechanical precision, avoiding my gaze, while his wife Susan chattered too brightly about their recent trip to Charleston, her voice artificially high and strained in a way that made my stomach churn. Zoe stood near the staircase with her phone still angled toward us, her young face pale as she watched Mia wipe tears on my coat sleeve, and the normalcy of it all made me want to scream. The way they could deliver such cruelty and then simply carry on sipping eggnog and adjusting tinsel as if a child's heart had not just been shattered on their marble floor. Then came the knock at the front door, heavy and official and deliberate, like fate announcing its arrival with 3 sharp raps that echoed through the suddenly silent lobby. The butler moved to answer it, and I felt every muscle in my body tense with anticipation of what was about to unfold, what I had been preparing for 7 long years. A courier stood on the threshold in a dark coat with the Horizon Hospitality logo embroidered on the chest, and beside him was Priya Sethi, my corporate attorney, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and elegant dark hair and a leather briefcase that looked expensive and serious and final. Priya stepped into the foyer with the confidence of someone holding all the cards, her heels clicking against the marble as she approached my mother with a professional smile that held no warmth. "Good evening, Mrs. Whitfield," she said, her voice carrying across the lobby with crystal clarity. "I have urgent documents from Horizon Hospitality Group that require your immediate attention and signature." My mother turned slowly, her practiced smile slipping for just a moment before she composed herself into the gracious hostess persona she wore like armor against the world. "I'm Margaret Whitfield," my mother said, gliding forward with her hand extended in a gesture that was more dismissal than greeting. "But surely this can wait until after the holidays, my dear. We're in the middle of our family Christmas celebration." She gestured around at the decorated space, at the guests now openly watching, at the image of perfection she had spent 40 years constructing brick by careful brick. Priya did not take her hand, and the slight sent a visible ripple of tension through my mother's shoulders, a crack in the facade that made me feel something close to satisfaction. Instead, Priya opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila envelope, holding it between them like a legal gauntlet being thrown down on a battlefield neither of them had expected to fight on tonight. "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Whitfield," Priya said in a tone that allowed no argument, no negotiation, no escape. "Per the terms of your existing contract with Horizon Hospitality, these documents require review and signatures within 24 hours of delivery, and the clock started the moment I walked through that door." My mother's smile turned brittle as she took the envelope, her perfectly manicured fingers leaving small indentations in the thick paper. "I don't understand," my mother said, looking to my father, who had moved closer, with his scotch glass still in hand, his face already flushing the way it did when he had signed something without reading it, when he had made a decision he could not take back. "Gerald, what is this about? What contract are they talking about?" My father shrugged helplessly, and I could see the moment Priya recognized him as the weaker link in their partnership, the one who would break first under pressure. Priya gestured toward the oak-paneled library just off the lobby, the room where my parents held their important meetings, where deals were made and fortunes shifted hands and lives were changed with the stroke of a pen. "Perhaps we should discuss this in private," Priya suggested, though her tone made it clear this was not really a suggestion at all, but a command wrapped in professional courtesy. "Along with Ms. Lena Whitfield, Mr. Daniel Whitfield, and yourself, of course." She looked at me then, one eyebrow raised in silent question, and I nodded once, sharply, feeling the weight of what I was about to do settle onto my shoulders like a mantle I had been preparing to wear for years. I told Mia to wait with Rosa, the kind-faced housekeeper who had always slipped me extra cookies when I was young, and who now pulled my daughter close with gentle hands, and then I followed the group into the library that smelled of leather and old wood and my father's expensive cigars. The room was lined with books my parents had never read, but kept for appearances, first editions in glass cases that were dusted weekly, but never opened. And my mother took her usual seat behind the massive mahogany desk, as if this were just another board meeting she could control with her iron will and sharp tongue. My father stood beside her, like a loyal soldier awaiting orders, while Daniel hovered near the door, looking like he might bolt at any second, his face pale and his hands fidgeting with his wedding ring in a nervous gesture I remembered from our childhood. I stood with my back to the fireplace, arms crossed, waiting for the storm I had been preparing for 7 years to finally break over their heads and wash away everything they thought they knew about power and control. Priya laid out documents on the desk with practiced precision, each one landing with a soft thud that felt like a countdown to detonation, like the ticking of a clock that had been wound years ago and was finally reaching its inevitable conclusion. "Let's begin with the basics, shall we?" she said in her most professional attorney voice, the one that had negotiated million-dollar deals and dismantled corporate empires with equal efficiency. "Mrs. Whitfield, do you recall signing a purchase agreement with Horizon Hospitality Group in March of 2021, approximately 3 years ago?" My mother waved a hand dismissively, her rings catching the firelight as she made the gesture that had dismissed servants and employees and inconvenient truths for decades. "Of course I recall it," she said, with the condescension of someone who thought she was still in control of the conversation, still the most powerful person in the room. They invested in Whitfield Inns during the pandemic when tourism collapsed, and we were facing significant financial challenges. A standard bailout arrangement, nothing unusual about it. She looked at my father for confirmation, and he nodded eagerly, though I could see the uncertainty creeping into his eyes like frost spreading across a window. Priya pulled out a highlighted document and turned it to face them, her finger pointing to specific lines that I had memorized months ago, lines that had given me hope when I felt powerless and afraid. "Not quite, Mrs. Whitfield," she said calmly, as if she were correcting a simple math error rather than dismantling someone's entire reality. "You didn't accept an investment. You sold them 62% of Whitfield Inns, which represents controlling interest, which means Horizon has been the majority owner of this company for nearly 3 years now." The color drained from my mother's face so quickly I thought she might faint, her hand gripping the edge of the desk until her knuckles went white as bone. "That's impossible," my mother whispered, her voice cracking for the first time in my memory, showing a vulnerability I had never seen her reveal. "We would never sell. We built this place from nothing. It's ours. It belongs to the Whitfield family." My father set down his scotch glass with a trembling hand that made the crystal clink against the wood like a small death knell, and I watched him realize that he had signed away his legacy without even knowing it. "But we still run everything," my father said weakly, grasping at the last threads of control like a drowning man reaching for a rope. "We're still CEO and chairman. We make all the decisions about operations and staff and guests." Priya slid another document across the polished wood, and I watched my mother's eyes scan the page with growing horror, her lips moving silently as she read words that were rewriting her understanding of her own life. "You serve at the pleasure of Horizon's board and primary shareholder," Priya explained, as if she were teaching a very slow student a simple lesson they should have learned long ago. "Which brings us to the second document you should review very carefully." She pulled out Horizon's founding papers, the ones I had signed 7 years ago in a tiny office above a coffee shop when my business partner and I had decided to stop being employees and start being owners. When I had decided to build something my parents could never take away from me. My name was there on the first page, clear and undeniable, in black ink that had not faded with time. Lena Marie Whitfield, co-founder and majority shareholder, Horizon Hospitality Group. I watched my mother's eyes scan the page, once, twice, 3 times, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something that made sense in her carefully ordered world, where daughters who got pregnant at 19 were supposed to fail and disappear, not succeed and return to claim what was rightfully theirs. "No," my mother said finally, her voice thin and reedy, like wind through a crack in old walls. "No, this is some kind of fraud, some kind of elaborate trick to humiliate us." She looked up at me for the first time since entering the library, and I saw real fear flash across her face before pride snapped back into place like a mask she could not bear to remove. "You expect us to believe that my disgraced daughter, the girl who threw her life away at 19, somehow owns my company?" I spoke for the first time since entering the room, my voice calm and cold as winter rain falling on stone. "Not your company anymore, Mother," I said, letting each word land with precision, with the weight of 7 years of preparation behind them. "Mine. Horizon bought you out when you were facing bankruptcy during the pandemic. I am Horizon. You've been working for me for 3 years, and you never even knew it." Daniel made a choked sound near the door, and when I looked at him, I saw tears streaming down his face because he had known all along, had been helping me quietly for years, documenting everything and waiting for this moment. My mother stood so abruptly, her chair scraped against the floor with a sound like a scream torn from wood and leather. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising toward hysteria, toward a loss of control I had never witnessed before. "I'll call our lawyers. I'll call the board. This cannot possibly be legal. There must be some mistake." Priya remained perfectly still, her hands folded on top of the papers like a judge delivering a verdict from which there could be no appeal. "The board is already aware, Mrs. Whitfield," Priya said quietly. pulling out her laptop and opening it to reveal 3 faces in video conference squares, the other Horizon board members watching us with serious expressions. In fact, they're in session right now via video conference, waiting for my report on tonight's events. She pulled up another document on screen, and I saw my mother's face go from red to white and back again. You see, there's another clause in your purchase agreement that we need to discuss. Clause 9, the morals clause that states if any executive's conduct materially damages the brand or creates a hostile work environment, Horizon may assume full operational control and remove said executives for cause. My mother's laugh was sharp and desperate, like glass breaking in an empty room. Morals clause? I've done nothing wrong. I've run this inn flawlessly for 40 years, maintained standards, upheld the Whitfield name with dignity and grace. Priya looked at me, and I knew this was my moment to speak the truth I had been carrying like stones in my pockets, weighing me down, but also grounding me, giving me strength. I stepped forward and placed my phone on the desk, the screen showing the text conversation with Priya from just minutes ago. "You called my daughter a bastard," I said quietly, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to remain calm and controlled. "In the lobby, in front of guests and staff and family, you called a 7-year-old child a slur because her parents weren't married when she was born. And that was the trigger, Mother. That was the moment you activated your own exit clause." My mother's face went from pale to red in an instant, fury overtaking fear like fire consuming dry wood. "She is a bastard by definition," my mother hissed, all pretense of civility gone now, all masks stripped away to reveal the ugliness underneath. "I won't pretend otherwise just to spare your feelings or coddle your mistake. I have standards, Lena, even if you threw yours away the night you spread your legs for some boy who didn't even stick around." Daniel's voice cut through the tension, cracking with emotion he had clearly been holding back for years, for decades perhaps. "I have recordings," Daniel said, stepping forward with a thick folder clutched in his hands like evidence at a trial, like proof of crimes committed in darkness and silence. Audio, video, emails, everything. Years of documentation, Lena. I've been saving it all, waiting for this moment, waiting to find the courage to use it. He dropped the folder on the desk beside Priya's documents, and it landed with a thud that sounded like judgment falling from a great height. My mother whirled on him, her eyes wide with betrayal and rage, and something that might have been fear if she had let herself feel it. "Daniel, you wouldn't dare turn against your own mother," she said, her voice somewhere between command and plea, between the old authority and new desperation. "I'm your mother. I raised you. I gave you everything you have." My brother's jaw tightened, and I saw him stand straighter than I had ever seen him stand before, as if he were finally allowing himself to take up space in a room that had always belonged to her. "You stopped being my mother the day you told Lena she was dead to us," Daniel said, his voice breaking but holding firm, holding true. "I've just been too scared to admit it until tonight, too scared to lose your approval. But I'm done protecting you at the expense of everyone else." Priya opened the folder and pulled out the first page, an email chain between my mother and a local gossip columnist, and she read aloud in a clinical voice that made the words even more damning. Quote, "Tell anyone who asks that my daughter Lena is mentally unstable and promiscuous. She is not to be hired at any reputable establishment in this city. She made her bed with that bastard child, and now she can lie in it." End quote. Priya looked up, her dark eyes hard as stone. "Signed by you, Mrs. Whitfield, and sent from your personal email to 7 different hospitality managers across Asheville over the past 5 years, constituting a pattern of defamation and conspiracy to deny employment." The room fell utterly silent except for the crackling fire and my mother's ragged breathing, and I felt time slow down as I watched her realize that all her careful control, all her manipulation, all her cruelty had finally caught up with her. "That's defamation," Priya continued, pulling out more documents, "and in this context, it's evidence of a pattern of abuse and discrimination that Horizon's board cannot and will not ignore." My mother gripped the edge of the desk as if it were the only thing keeping her upright in a world that was tilting beneath her feet. "You don't understand what I built here," my mother said, her voice rising toward desperation, toward a plea for understanding that came too late to matter. "A legacy, a name that means something in this community, standards that have been forgotten in a world that celebrates mediocrity and mistake. I will not let her destroy it with her poor choices and her shameful past." I felt something cold and final settle in my chest, like ice forming over water, permanent and unbreakable. "You keep forgetting, Mother," I said, my voice steady now, strong with the certainty of someone who had finally stopped seeking approval from people who would never give it. "This roof stopped being yours a long time ago, and tonight you triggered your own exit clause by showing everyone exactly who you really are beneath all the pearls and polish." The library door opened suddenly, and Zoe slipped in with her phone still in her hand, her young face pale and her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Aunt Lena," Zoe whispered, her voice shaking, "you need to know something about my live stream. It's still going, and people are sharing it everywhere. It's gone viral." She held up her phone, and I saw the viewer count climbing impossibly fast. 300, 500, 800, 1,000, numbers rising like a tide that could not be stopped. In the chat, comments flew past faster than I could read them. Words like "disgusting" and "that poor child" and "someone needs to stop this woman," scrolling endlessly down the screen like judgment rendered by strangers who had seen my mother's true face. My mother lunged for the phone, but Zoe stepped back quickly, clutching it to her chest with trembling hands. "I can't stop it now, even if I wanted to," Zoe said, tears streaming down her face. "It's already been shared hundreds of times, Grandma. Everyone is watching what you did to Mia." Priya stood and gathered her documents with efficient movements that suggested this meeting was about to end whether my parents wanted it to or not. "Mrs. Whitfield, Mr. Whitfield, the Horizon Board will convene in 30 minutes to vote on your immediate removal as CEO and chairman, effective tonight," Priya said in a tone that allowed no argument, no negotiation, no escape from consequences that had been building for years. "You have until then to prepare any statement you wish to make in your defense, though I would strongly advise you to consult legal counsel before saying anything further that might be used against you in subsequent proceedings." My father finally found his voice, though it came out weak and slurred from the scotch he had been drinking to avoid facing the truth. "Lena, please," he said, looking at me with watery eyes that held no real remorse, only fear of losing what he valued most. "We're family. We can work this out. Just tell them to stop this vote. Tell them it was all a misunderstanding." I looked at the man who had stood silent while my mother called my daughter a slur, who had signed away his company without reading the contract, who had chosen appearances over his own child for 14 years. "You chose your side a long time ago, Dad," I said quietly, feeling the finality of the words settle into my bones like truth I had always known but never spoken aloud. "Now I'm choosing mine, and it's not you. It's not this version of family that requires cruelty as the price of admission." We filed out of the library and back into the chaos of the lobby, where staff whispered in tight clusters and guests checked their phones, no doubt finding the viral video already spreading across social media like wildfire through dry brush. I found Mia in the staff kitchen with Rosa, drinking hot chocolate from a mug that looked comically large in her small hands, her eyes still red-rimmed but calmer now, safer here among people who knew how to be kind. "Mommy," she said when she saw me, setting down the mug carefully, "Rosa said sometimes grown-ups say mean things they don't mean, but does Grandma mean it?" I knelt down and took her small face in my hands, feeling my heart break and rebuild itself all at once, stronger than before. "Yes, baby," I said honestly, because I would not lie to protect someone who had just hurt her, would not teach her to accept cruelty in the name of family peace. "She means it, but it doesn't matter, because what she thinks doesn't define who you are or how much you're loved." That night, we sat through what was supposed to be a family Christmas dinner, though the word family felt like a cruel joke as my mother presided at the head of the table with a fixed smile while my father drank steadily and the other guests made awkward small talk, pretending not to notice the tension thick enough to choke on. When my mother suggested Mia eat with the staff in the kitchen, where she would be more comfortable, something in me finally, irrevocably, snapped, and I stood up so abruptly my chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. "You preach about family and values and the Whitfield name, Mother," I said, my voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "But you're stealing from the people who actually keep this place running, the staff who serve you and clean your rooms and make your beds, while you take credit for their labor." I pulled out Daniel's folder and dropped it on the table hard enough to make the crystal rattle like breaking glass. The confrontation that followed was swift and brutal, my mother's carefully constructed facade crumbling under the weight of evidence and live-streamed truth. And when the Horizon Board voted unanimously to remove her as CEO, I watched something die in her eyes that might have been her sense of invincibility. She left without another word, her heels echoing down the hall like the sound of an empire falling, and Priya closed her laptop with a soft click that sounded like the closing of a chapter I had been writing for 7 years. 6 months later, I stood in the same lobby, but everything had changed in ways both visible and invisible, and the sign outside no longer read, "The Whitfield House," but instead said, "The Hart House," in elegant script, honoring my grandmother's maiden name and symbolizing the fresh start we had built from ashes. We had restored every penny to the employee pension fund, implemented oversight procedures, given raises to staff who had been underpaid for years, and launched a scholarship program for single parents studying hospitality. And the local paper had run a front-page story about our transformation that made me cry, with something that felt like vindication mixed with grief. That next Christmas, 1 year after the night that had changed everything, I hosted our first real family celebration at the Hart House, and the dining room was filled with people who had been chosen not by blood, but by the bonds we had built through truth and love and mutual respect. Rosa and her family sat near the fireplace. Daniel and Susan laughed with Zoe about something on her phone, and the scholarship recipients mingled with staff, sharing stories and dreams, while local friends filled the remaining seats with warmth and genuine affection that needed no performance, no masks, no cruelty to maintain. After dinner, Mia stood up with a piece of paper in her hands, her cheeks pink, but her voice steady in a way it had not been a year ago when her grandmother had tried to break her spirit. "I wrote something for school about what family means," she announced to the room, and everyone fell quiet, giving her their full attention. "My grandma said I didn't belong in her house because my parents weren't married when I was born," Mia read, her young voice clear and strong. "She called me a bad word and told my mom to take me away, and I was really sad and scared." I saw Rosa wipe her eyes, saw Daniel grip Susan's hand tightly, saw love reflected in every face watching my daughter claim her truth. "But my mom showed me something important," Mia continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Family isn't about who shares your last name or your blood. Family is people who stand up for you when someone is mean, people who help you even when it's hard for them, people who choose to love you every single day." She looked around the room at all the faces watching her with love and pride. "My mom says that sometimes houses have rotten beams, and if you don't take them out, the whole house falls down. And Grandma was a rotten beam. It hurt to take her out. But now our house is stronger, and now we have room for people who actually want to be here. And that's what real family is." The room erupted in applause, and I stood with a throat tight with emotion, raising my glass to toast chosen family and second chances and building something better from something broken. My mother had called my daughter a bastard and thought she had won, thought her cruelty would send us crawling back into whatever shadows she had decided we belonged in. But she had not known I already held the keys to her kingdom, had been quietly preparing for years, building alliances and documentation and leverage, while she thought I was powerless and broken. If you're standing in a doorway like I was, one foot in a toxic past and one foot in a future you're too scared to claim. I want you to know something that took me 14 years to learn. You are allowed to close that door. You are allowed to build a new house. You are allowed to define family on your own terms and protect yourself and your children and demand respect instead of begging for scraps of conditional love. It will hurt like nothing you've ever felt. It will feel like losing everything. But on the other side of that loss is a freedom you cannot imagine until you live it. A peace that comes from finally choosing yourself and the people who choose you back. My daughter will never have to beg to belong in her own family's house. And that doorbell that rang on Christmas Eve did not just announce the end of my parents' reign, but the beginning of ours. A new legacy, built not on cruelty and control, but on truth and chosen love, and the simple, radical act of protecting the vulnerable instead of sacrificing them to maintain an image. Sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is quietly prepare, document everything, build your strength in secret, and then, when the moment comes, when that doorbell finally rings, stand your ground and let the truth speak for itself, loud and clear and undeniable, until everyone can hear it, until no one can look away, until justice finally sounds like church bells on Christmas morning.